Ah, subthemes. They can make your deck better, or they can make your deck worse, and either of those two things might be a desirable outcome depending on what you look for in a game of Magic the Gathering. Hi there, I'm Alex, and today I'm here to tell you about a passion of mine, making decks do more things. Most EDH decks will have a theme, merfolk, tokens, on-attack triggers, and so forth, and this is a nice place to start in getting a deck to do something. However, eventually that one theme might start to get a little boring, and your eyes might begin to wander. That on-attack trigger makes tokens. Can I play harder into that? I really like this zombie creature that makes me discard cards. Can I make my deck focus more on discard? This ETB creature searches up legendary cards. I wonder how that might fit into my Blink deck. And this makes sense. Having your deck do more stuff, have more textured play paths, produce more unexpected results, all of this will be desirable to a lot of players, particularly players who have already played a lot with more linear styles of deck. So here, I'm going to be making a little guide on how to answer the sorts of questions I mentioned earlier about specific cards you're finding yourself transfixed by, and at the end, you might have an exciting arsenal of brand new questions to probe your deck with. With that said, let's begin. Assuming you're not trying to obliterate your deck's consistency, a good place to start in expanding your deck's synergy universe is going to be what I'll call fulcrum cards. This is a thing that naturally ties together multiple subthemes, and it can take a variety of different forms, but typically comes in the form of a payoff from one theme that rewards another. Throne of Geth ties together artifact, sacrifice, and counters, Displacer Kitten ties together the Flicker and Spellslinger archetypes, and Strength from the Fallen ties together enchantments and creature-stuffed graveyards, with a resulting payoff that can work well for a Power Matters deck. These are pretty clear examples of fulcrum cards, but there are a lot of other examples that are less obvious, but absolutely there if you go looking. Professional Facebreaker rewards a board of evasive creatures with some artifact tokens that can crack for mana. Quicksmith Genius rewards artifacts entering with rummages that can feed graveyard strategies. And Squee, Dubious Monarch, rewards a stocked graveyard with a reanimated attacker that generates tokens. Why were all of those examples red 3-drops, you might ask? No particular reason, but you should definitely put them all in the same deck. Regardless, all of these cards represent points of fusion between different archetypes, connective glue that involves setup for one archetype turning into payoff for another. An important consideration when thinking about this sort of card is the floor of the effect. I'm stat-brained, so I'd be thinking about maybe the 25th percentile game for a card, but basically what we're wondering is how will the card feel in a subpar situation, when it's not living up to our wildest dreams? For some of the cards I mentioned earlier, the floor is pretty high. Professional Facebreaker will usually manage to generate at least a couple treasures, and Displacer Kitten can at least serve as protection even if no juicy ETB creatures are present. For others, the floor might be a lot lower though. Dross Scorpion is a card I run in one of my decks that works as a fulcrum point between artifact creatures hitting graveyard and tap effects, but this card could easily end up being a poorly statted creature with a single untap on death, and that's important to keep in mind. It gets even worse for non-creature permanents. In my most recent deck review, one of my supporters was trying to integrate a small-ish Astral Slide Flicker package into a deck, and unfortunately, without any cycling cards in hand, that card is just a 3-mana textless enchantment. This is where a bit of discernment is necessary. It's important to figure out what works as a minor part of a deck, and what has no business being outside a deck that doesn't heavily support it, due to its low floor. As a related example of this, I've had a handful of people suggest Ret Tomb Mystic for my Astral Slide deck. At first glance, this might make sense. I'm playing a deck trying to cycle cards, this card gives all my creatures cycling, and it's a wizard to top it all off, grabbable with either of my wizard cycling cards. However, the issue with adding a card like this is that, at its floor, it will always consume a card slot that could have gone to an ETB creature, or some card draw, or a card that itself has cycling and can replace itself. And then, how high do you think the ceiling will be in a deck where over 40% of the creatures already have cycling? It looks good at first, and I'm sure it's great in a more general graveyard deck, but once we do the floor-ceiling calculation, it becomes clear that this little bird gets mogged by a merfolk looter in this particular deck. As you might have guessed, a major factor in the floor-ceiling discussion is the amount of deck space required to support a particular card. A lot of possible fulcrum cards might already be within your synergy family of choice, and might create resources that are already useful to what you're doing, even if they theoretically might tie naturally into a different subtheme. We can see this with the treasure example earlier, where treasures are just a naturally useful tool for basically all decks. This stands in contrast to something like a Doorkeeper in an Arcades the Strategist deck. How do you make target player milling feel useful for a theme that usually wins through combat damage and doesn't traditionally utilize the graveyard very much? I'm sure plenty of people have done it, but it requires more divergence from the traditional Arcades game plan than a lot of other Defenders payoffs, and will likely demand more deck space to be any good as a result. Another angle for thinking about deck space could be to consider how closely interlinked two different themes are to one another. Sometimes there will be a whole bunch of fulcrum cards for a particular set of two themes, with one I've utilized in the past being artifacts and ETB effects. Thought Monitor, Conjurer's Closet, Mirror Battlesphere, Mimic Vat, the Mages, there's a whole lot of options there, and if you're playing a bunch of these, your dual-themed deck experience might end up feeling decently compact, despite its somewhat mechanically broad nature. However, many other sets of two themes have dramatically less innate shared DNA. If I'm trying to make a deck that combines Cast from Exile and Landfall, well, there are two Landfall cards with Exile You May Play text, and there are also cards that reward playing lands from Exile in addition to casting spells, which work well for us. And then if we dive into From Anywhere Other Than Your Hand effects as well, we might find some roundabout synergies in other Landfall cards such as Courser of Krufix and Hedron Crab, among others. Hopefully you can see what I'm getting at here. Sometimes you're just going to have a bit of a hard time combining two themes. Now, does this mean that you shouldn't smash together two very different synergy families? No. Artifacts plus ETB, tokens plus 1/1 counters, these have been done tens of thousands of times before for good reason, but you always have the opportunity to do something different, something unique, something more specifically suited to who you are as a player. What you should do, though, is know that's what you're doing, figure out why you're doing that, and then figure out a plan of action based on what your goals are. Let's say you're building an initiative deck with a heavy emphasis on legendary permanents in general and the background enchantments in particular. Cool. A bit tricky, but there are some possible points of connection here. Next, it's important to figure out the reason for building the deck, because that will affect the decisions you make. If you're trying to build a decent bracket 3 deck with this set of restrictions as a challenge, you'll want to dial in hard on the points of cohesion, and maybe consider ways you can get the different elements to come together more often. Maybe we run partner commanders to get full use out of Dungeon Delver, and pick colors that offer the most utility in putting together our game plan. If we decide that Dungeon Delver is a key card for us, maybe we add some cards like Enlightened Tutor, Muddle the Mixture, and a couple other helpful tutors in whatever colors we end up in, so that we can get that card more often, and then maybe we pair that with other useful cards that fit the same tutoring restrictions. If we have the goal of getting the most mechanically fluid version of Initiative Legendaries, there are some cool decision paths we can run down, and the end result will likely be a very unique Bracket 3 deck. Some people might worry that tutors will homogenize the play experience of a deck, but this won't necessarily be true. Card selection tools like filtering spells and conditional tutors will reduce the play pattern variance of a deck, but if you add them to a deck that would otherwise have extreme levels of play pattern variance due to having a lot of moving parts, you'll likely end up in a place that is still very fresh and dynamic to play with. Now let's say we're building with a different goal. We're just trying to have a good time, and are likely aiming for a more laid-back Bracket 2 style deck. This is also a very valid goal, and honestly it's a pretty fantastic reason to make a deck that might be a little bit mechanically dubious. If your starting point is a naturally slower paced political mechanic like Initiative, and if you're introducing extra layers of synergy rather than filling up your deck with high quality staple creatures, you're going to end up with something that plays quite well at lower power tables. You'll want to make sure you're running enough filtering so that your deck functions and so that you're having fun throughout the whole process, but the play pattern of a deck that gradually filters for different elements of its cool, funky game plan is one that is perfect for a Bracket 2 game in both pace and nature. As a final note here, playing at a lower power table is also a great place for a somewhat mechanically disjointed deck because incentives align perfectly on what sorts of vegetables you should be running, particularly removal. Lower power opponents won't require all the best removal the game has to offer, and this means that you can do something that's already nice to do, run some of the higher mana options with added utility for your synergy families. My Bracket 2 Incubators deck has 16 cards I've categorized as interaction, which is a decent number, but if I click through these on the Architect page, literally all of them do something else for the deck. This is nice for keeping a mechanically messy deck from feeling too bad, and it also lets me play with cards that are a bit more unique within the Commander format. Is Spread the Sickness the best removal this game has to offer? Definitely not, but it feels immensely at home in this deck, and I wouldn't dare cut it. Thanks for watching. I'm going to be at MagicCon Vegas in just a week or so, and I'll be hosting a panel along with the Trinket Mage and a couple friends of the podcast. Come watch that, or get a sticker, or just say hi, whatever floats your boat. If you want to support what I do here, you can grab some high-quality sleeves from Dragon Shield, affiliate link in the description, or you can support me more directly through Patreon or a YouTube membership. These lovely people, some of whom are on screen now, help let me keep doing what I do here, and they also receive bonus videos from me once per month or so, plus a chance at a deck review every 3 months. If you want to join this illustrious crowd, the links and/or buttons to do so are probably on your screen somewhere, unless something has gone horribly wrong.